this morning comes from Luke chapter 10, beginning in verse 25. Hear these familiar words. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" he replied. "How do you read it?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this, and you will live." But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" In reply, Jesus said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes and beat him and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by the other side. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. 'Look after him,' he said, 'and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have.' Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers?" The expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise." The word of God for the people of God.
Praise God.
Let's pray. Oh God, this morning we ask that you would open up our hearts and our minds, and that your Spirit might work within us, that we might pattern our lives after your Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ. And it's in his name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
I remember a few years ago when Derek got notified that someone by the name of Rick Deere had passed. Now, I never had the chance to meet Rick Deere, but Derek was devastated at the news of his passing. He had been battling prostate cancer for a number of years, and so we knew that it was probably going to happen. We just didn't know when. But Rick Deere was the director of Deer Valley YMCA Family Camp, which is where Derek's family has been going since before Derek was even born, every single summer like clockwork. And Rick retired, or he moved on to another position before I started attending Deer Valley. But I would always hear about him, and I would hear about the kind of person that he was. And that year when he passed sometime in the spring, I believe. That summer at camp, all of the staff were wearing these shirts that said, "I am third." Rick would always say that to the staff, to families, to everybody who was a part of Deer Valley. "I am third." Because Rick himself tried to live by these words. And what they meant was God first, others second, and I am third. Because he was all about living a life of servanthood, of thinking of God and others before he thought of himself and his own interests. I am third. Those words came to me this week as I was studying the passage from Philippians and the familiar story of the Good Samaritan. I am third. Today we continue talking about spiritual disciplines, and today we're talking about the discipline of service. And so we begin with this story of the Good Samaritan. Most of us have probably heard this story a million times. It's so familiar, in fact, that I think sometimes we lose sight of the impact of what Jesus was trying to communicate here. So here we are, we have this man who is traveling between Jerusalem and Jericho for whatever reason, we don't know, but I can guarantee he was not anticipating at the start of his day that his day was going to end up like it did, but he is taken upon by robbers and beaten and left for dead on the side of the road. I mean, this is not a good day for this guy. And along come some other travelers, the priest and then the Levite. And the priest and the Levite, I imagine if we were in today's world, would be a little bit like a pastor or a church leader. And maybe the pastor is on his or her way to lead worship. And maybe the church leader is on his or her way to an administrative council meeting or some other kind of church meeting where important things are going to be discussed and important decisions are going to be made. But I imagine in today's world, if the priest and the Levite were in today's world, they would be in a rush to be doing the important things as people of God. And so they probably saw this man on the side of the road, and they thought, oh, I feel bad for this guy. I wish I could stop and help him, but I have more important things I have to go do. I can't stop and help him. So surely somebody will stop and help him, but I'm going to be late if I stop now. Plus, not to mention, in this day and time, this man was probably covered in blood, and for the priest or the Levite, if they were to stop and tend to this man's wounds and get blood on themselves, that would have made them even later for whatever it was they were doing, whatever they were on their way to, because they would have had to go through a proper ritual of purifying themselves and cleansing themselves from touching that which had been made unclean, this man. And so they continue on their way, and they have their priorities, and serving and caring for this man is not one of them. And so the man continues to lie on the side of the road, and then along comes the Samaritan. And just a reminder for those who may have forgotten, Samaritans and Jews were not friends. They did not get along. Samaritans worshipped differently than Jews. They lived differently. They were just not best buddies. So much so, in fact, that when Jews were traveling from the northern region of Galilee and they needed to come down to the southern region of Judea, they would go around Samaria, which lay in the middle, just so they wouldn't have to come in contact with any of those people. And so here comes the Samaritan, one of those. And the Samaritan shows us what it is to have the mind of Christ, actually. Because what we see in the story is when the Samaritan comes along, it says he traveled and he came to the place where the man was and saw him. And when he saw him, he took pity on him. Or some translations say he had compassion for him. Compassion literally means to suffer with, to suffer alongside. When we are moved to compassion, when we feel compassion for someone, that's the kind of thing where we feel within us and we feel for the person who is suffering. Like we're affected by it. We can imagine what it is like to be in their place. And we are moved. We cannot stay the same. This Samaritan saw and was moved with compassion for this man who was on the side of the road. Now, I have to imagine there was probably some internal dialogue he was having with himself in his head. Like he could probably recognize, oh, this may be a Jewish man, what is it going to mean if I stop and take care of him? Or maybe not. Maybe those thoughts didn't even enter into his head because he simply saw the person who was suffering. Regardless, the Samaritan man gets down on his hands and his knees to clean and to bandage the wounds of this Jewish man who has been left for dead. He uses his own oil, his own wine, and he puts this man on his own donkey. And then he takes him to an inn and gets him a room and takes care of him there, and then he even gives money to the innkeeper. Now, he doesn't just give money to the innkeeper and say, all right, I'm done here, good luck. He says, here, I can give this to you right now, and then I need to go, but I will be coming back. And when I do, I have even more that I can give to make sure this man is taken care of. Here we have the image of one who is a servant to his neighbor. Now, I have to wonder what happened after this encounter between the Samaritan and the Jewish man left for dead. I have to wonder what the Jewish man was thinking when he kind of came to and was healed enough and was maybe, becoming more aware of what was going on around him. I wonder what it was like for him to realize that it was a Samaritan who stopped for him. And I imagine that meeting when the Samaritan came back to the inn to check on him, that there were some real interesting conversations that happened. I have to imagine that for this Jewish man, for the rest of his life, he didn't look at Samaritans as those people anymore. But instead, he looked upon this man as a friend, as a brother, and no longer somebody who was to be avoided or to keep at arm's length. And I imagine something similar may have happened for the Samaritan man as he listened to the promptings to go and care for him and to give what he had for the care of this stranger, that his life was also transformed. And he realized serving another is the greatest calling I can live out. Now in the Philippians passage that I read, we have this beautiful hymn that begins with, and though he had equality with God, he did not consider equality with God something to be grasped for himself. He didn't consider that power as something that he should hold on to. But instead, he emptied himself. And the word there is kenosis. He emptied himself of power, poured it all out, and took the form of a slave. Now, some translations will translate that as he took the form of a servant, partially because of the baggage around the word slavery in our own history. But honestly, slave is a better word here. Because a slave in Jesus' time, and even within our own messed up history, to be a slave was to be a person without rights. And what this passage tells us is that Jesus willingly chose to give up his rights as one who is divine. He gave up the power in order to love and serve human beings and to become obedient to death, even death on a cross. He emptied himself out. When we think about the Samaritan, he emptied himself out in many ways. He emptied out, literally, his oil and his wine to clean the man's wounds. He emptied out his time. He emptied out his purse in order to care for the man. He willingly gave up that which was his in order to serve the man beaten and left on the side of the road. Philippians tells us that Jesus has done that for all of us. Emptied himself utterly out for the sake of us who are beaten and left for dead on the side of the road by this thing called sin. Jesus models for us what it is to be a servant, to live a life of service. And the Good Samaritan shows us what it is to pattern our lives after the way of Jesus Christ. Service, as a discipline, is not simply doing nice things for other people or doing nice things for the sake of the community every so often. I mean, I know what comes to mind for me is when I think service, I'm like, oh, community service. We'll go and we'll pick trash up, or we'll sort things at Heart and Hand, or we'll bring food. And while certainly all of those things are an aspect of what it is to live lives of service, the spiritual discipline of service is not about just occasional doing of those kinds of things. It is about an attitude. It is about an orientation. It is about a lifestyle. In his book, Celebration of Discipline, which I've been referencing throughout this series on spiritual disciplines, Richard Foster talks about service, and he contrasts self-righteous service and true service. And I know as I was reading the part where he talks about self-righteous service, that there are times in my life where I feel myself kind of getting caught up in that understanding or that way of doing service. Service that says, hey, look at the good that I'm doing, or, you know, I can feel really good about myself for doing X, Y, or Z. And I actually want to read his contrast between self-righteous service and true service, because I feel like it really helps us to think about our own orientation in life. Are we patterning ourselves after the very way, the very being of Jesus? Or are we satisfied with just doing nice things here and there? He says, self-righteous service comes through human effort. It expends immense amounts of energy calculating and scheming how to render the service. Self-righteous service is impressed with the big deal. It is concerned to make impressive gains on ecclesiastical scoreboards, or in other words, church scoreboards of, you know, how many people have we brought in or had come to this. It enjoys serving, especially when the service is titanic, when it's big. Self-righteous service requires external rewards. It needs to know that people see and appreciate the effort. It seeks human applause with proper religious modesty, of course. And I admit that at times, that sometimes motivates me. Self-righteous service is highly concerned about results. It eagerly awaits to see if the person served will reciprocate in kind. and it becomes bitter when the results fall below expectations. Self-righteous service picks and chooses whom to serve. Sometimes the high and powerful are served because that will ensure a certain advantage. But sometimes the low and the defenseless are served because that will ensure a humble image. Self-righteous service is affected by moods and whims. It can serve only when there is a feeling to serve. Self-righteous service is temporary. It functions only while the specific acts of service are being performed. And then, having served, it can rest easy. Self-righteous service is insensitive. It insists on meeting the need even when to do so would be destructive. It demands the opportunity to help. Self-righteous service fractures community. And in the final analysis, once all the religious trappings are removed, it centers in the glorification of the individual. Therefore, it puts others into its debt and becomes one of the most subtle and destructive forms of manipulation known. That's self-righteous service. But then he contrasts true service. He says true service comes from a relationship with the divine other deep inside. We serve out of whispered promptings, divine urgings, kind of like what in my imagination I see the Good Samaritan experiencing as he's traveling on the road. True service finds it almost impossible to distinguish the small from the large service. True service rests contented in hiddenness. It doesn't fear the lights and glare of attention, but it does not seek them either. True service is free of the need to calculate results. It delights only in the service. It can serve enemies as freely as friends. True service is indiscriminate in its ministry. It has heard the command of Jesus to be the servant of all. True service ministers simply and faithfully because there is a need. It knows that the feeling to serve can often be a hindrance to true service. True service is a lifestyle. It acts from ingrained patterns of living. It springs spontaneously to meet human need. True service can withhold the service as freely as perform it. It can listen with tenderness and patience before acting. It can serve by waiting in silence. True service builds community. It quietly and unpretentiously goes about caring for the needs of others. It draws, binds, heals, and builds. True service is a way of life. When I look at the Good Samaritan and how he came to do these things, I notice several things. The first thing is he saw the man. He saw him. He had his eyes open and he was looking around him. You know, the priest and the Levite, they may have been good and holy people, but they had blinders on. They had tunnel vision. They were busy trying to get to whatever it was that they thought they needed to get to, that they did not have their eyes open to those who were around them. And so they didn't even see, or if they saw, they were able to pass on by. The first thing about living lives of service, the spiritual discipline of service, is we have to have our eyes open to those around us. And I admit that I sometimes get tunnel vision, like the priest or the Levite, and I fail to really open my eyes and see. The second thing, that once he sees, he stops. He stops and he comes to the place where the man is. And he is moved with compassion compassion. When our eyes are opened and we can see somebody around us who is hurting, who is suffering, who might just need some help, it's not enough to just see. We have to stop, whether it's a big thing or a small thing, and to serve them in the way that we can. Third, this man, the Samaritan, empties himself of time, of resources, of what he has to give. And he willingly uses them and gives them up for the sake of the man on the side of the road. To live lives of service, we have to see, we have to stop with a sense of compassion, and we have to willingly give of ourselves for the sake of the other. That is exactly what Philippians 2 talks about Christ doing for us. And so as we've considered these disciplines over the past weeks of fasting and confession, and prayer and study, service too is a way of being. And so today, may we open ourselves up, that our minds, that our hearts, and our lives may be patterned after the self-emptying